Joan Ifland, PhD, is the leading expert in processed food addiction. In fact, she wrote the book on the issue, and it's called Processed Food Addiction. With over 20 years of experience in the field, she now helps practitioners manage and assist their clients with this kind of addiction recovery. After recovering from her own struggles, Joan committed to help individuals obtain a higher quality of life and avoid the preventable diseases so common in today's environment of these highly addictive processed foods. We're so eager to learn more from you. Welcome, Joan Ifland.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's wonderful that you're here. I wanted to start off sort of in the macro first, and then we'll go down to the personal. Because one of the things that you've taught me, certainly, is that this processed food addiction is something that started around in the 1980s. There was a shift in the way that we ate in the United States. So talk a little bit, please, to us about how this change happened in the food industry and how it's affected us, especially here in the United States.
Okay, this is a great place to start. I like starting with business practices. So I had this weird background, right? My undergraduate degree is in political science and economics, and I worked in a state legislature as a fiscal analyst, and then I went to business school at Stanford, and then I worked in a corporation for 5 years, and then I was so sick that I couldn't go back to work after having my 2 babies. So what happened? I'm very interested in business models, and what we see is that in 1985 through 87, the tobacco industry bought Kraft, Nabisco, and General Foods. And they immediately started applying the addiction business model. There's a business model for alcohol and vaping and tobacco and cannabis. And the pharmaceutical industry used it to sell opiates to doctors. It's a business model. It's the 5 A's of the addiction business model. You ramp up the addictive properties in the product, but you hide it. You layer on a lot of advertising. You make it available everywhere so people can use it often enough to create the addiction. You make it very affordable. It has to be cheap enough to be used often enough. And then you aim at the youngest age. So in the case of processed foods, those are, at the moment of conception, if the parents are eating processed foods, the genes are already replicating in an addictive way. And you never let up. Like the first thing that you see those tobacco companies doing is ramping up the Saturday morning cartoon commercials from about already 160 per Saturday morning to like 560 in the space of 7 years. And this is how you addict a brain cell. First, you expose the brain to the addictive substances, sugar, fat, salt, dairy, etc. And then you constantly provoke it. You constantly remind, you associate. By association, you are literally, through Pavlovian conditioning, teaching those little tiny young brain cells to crave, to release a lot of dopamine, serotonin, cannabinoids, and opiates. That's an addiction.
I'm just curious, the tobacco industry who bought these food companies, do you think that they realized that these foods were unhealthy? Like, obviously they created this addictive model so that they would buy a lot of them, but they have families themselves at home that they are making sick. So at the beginning, there wasn't a realization that this food could make people sick or would make people sick.
Oh, of course there was.
Okay.
But here's how I answer that question. So I've read a lot about the tobacco experience. I believe this quote comes from a book called Cigarette Papers. You know that as part of the tobacco settlement, they were required to deposit thousands of documents. They deposited a lot at the University of California, San Francisco. So this book, Cigarette Papers, quotes one of the tobacco executives saying, "I would rather have a shorter life with cigarettes than a longer life without." Well, that's addictive thinking. You know, you see the dominance of the addicted brain cells in that line of reasoning. That's not frontal lobe dominance. That's the addicted brain cells. I'd rather be sick, I'd rather be dying and still using. And that's why addictions are lethal.
I think I heard you also say that the head of some junk food company doesn't feed his own kids the food that his company, what was that?
Yeah, so that we have a new book, Hooked by Michael Moss, has just come out.
How they hooked us.
I don't know how he did, but you know, that's his second book. Sugar, Fat, Salt was the first one. He got these executives to talk to him. He got the consultants who went in and ramped up the sugar, fat, salt content of processed foods. Howie Moskowitz, he got Howie Moskowitz to talk to him. Howie Moskowitz, so finally, towards the end of Sugar, Fat, Salt, Michael Moss is asking him.
And who is he? I don't know.
So he's a Harvard PhD in experimental psychology of marketing. Like, these schools actually turn out these monstrous people. And what he did was he developed a very data-intense method for figuring out what is the maximum amount of sugar, fat, salt we can put in a product before the consumer rejects it. Well, sugar, fat, salt are highly addictive. When you touch a taste bud or the roof of your mouth with sugar, fat, salt, the brain recognizes it within half a second. So this is opposed to 10 seconds for cigarette smoke or 10 minutes for cocaine. Highly addictive. And they just ramped up. Like, before Howie Moskowitz, tomato sauce did not have sugar in it. After Howie Moskowitz, tomato sauce, a half cup serving, nobody eats just half a cup. It had the equivalent of the sugar content of 2 Oreos. So maybe in 1970, you could eat 1 slice of bread. But by 1999, you would eat 1 slice of bread. The addiction would be triggered by the large quantity of sugar, fat, salt in that slice of bread, and you would end up eating the loaf. This is how America and the world, because the tobacco industry already had relationships around the world for the corner stores where they were selling cigarettes, and for the advertising. Remember, the availability and affordability, availability and advertising are 2 of the 5 A's. And tobacco was able to just push these processed foods right through those channels. And that's why obesity spread around the world so fast. 20 years is nothing.
It's the bliss point. Is that what they're trying to get?
Yes, and now Michael Moss has redeemed himself, in my eyes, because the second book, he confesses. I wasn't sure about the addiction in the first book, but now I am. And the second book repeatedly and explicitly references processed food addiction. So he has redeemed himself. The whole Sugar, Fat, Salt book is about food addiction, but he skirted it. And now he's facing it head on.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you and took you off track. There was an executive who said that he wouldn't feed his kids the product. And was that the Lunchables guy, or who was
I
that?
think it was, because the salt content in Lunchables is astronomical. So you can teach a child salt addiction by this repeat exposure, by applying the addiction business model. Children are born with a preference for sugar. You don't have to teach them sugar addiction. You just reinforce it by giving them a lot of it. Yeah.
Right, because there's lactose in their own mother's breast milk, probably to get them to eat and bond. It's across history of all mammals, right? You have a baby that's struggling to bond and eat, then they want to come back for that sweet.
Yeah.
Did you yourself struggle with food addiction?
Oh gosh, I did.
This is sad.
So I grew up thin, and I was born in 1951. Very few people were overweight in that era. We were all super thin, but we were violent. I mean, my household was always fighting. So there was my mother with caffeine and sugar in her hand most of the time. My father, my mother did not know how to cook, so she used a lot of convenience foods. And our particular reaction is we're very sensitive to the elevated adrenaline that comes with using processed foods, like all drugs. And we fought all the time. It was it was a traumatic upbringing.
I
And
told
then
you
when I
it
had my own
affects your
kids
hormones.
in 83 and 84, I was desperate not to be that person that was constantly blowing up, raging, unpleasant, critical, anxious. And I started therapy. I did 10 years of therapy. Then I started joined a women's organization, a healing organization, and finally a 12-step group for codependency, and none of it helped. And then but I started yo-yo dieting when I had my two kids because I quit smoking. I thought, this is interesting. There was plenty of evidence that when you quit smoking, you start eating. And I used to think, the tobacco company just saw that coming. It just friggin' moved right over.
Mm-hmm.
But it was more than that.
Transferable.
It was the invention of high fructose corn syrup, which is cheap. Remember, it has to be affordable. And then the corrupt U.S. government in the food pyramid was advocating. I mean, I'm sure the tobacco executives couldn't believe their ears. Not only are their advertising being suppressed, the U.S. government is helping them because the whole bottom row of the first food pyramid, the effort for that was led by a Harvard researcher who had been in the pocket of the sugar industry. So refined carbohydrates were that whole bottom row.
You're through your stress and your strife and,
Yes.
and your process. You
Yes.
started leaning into, what did you start buying that you
Well,
got addicted to?
I got in the codependency group. Somebody heard the sugar driving my behavior, so they suggested a different 12-step group, food addicts in recovery. And I'm like, why? Because I was in a thin phase. But at the end of the year, I'd regained the weight. I said, well, okay, I'll try that. And immediately, very weird things started happening. Like I lost the cravings, and I lost the brain fog, and I lost the fatigue. And I'm like, what is going on? I was eating way too much food, but by the end of the week, I'd lost 2 pounds.
When you shifted from what to what? I would love to be specific. Like donuts to potatoes, or like
no,
what?
When I took out the sugars and flours.
Okay, so
Sugars and flours.
Baked goods and
yeah,
like that?
Anything that had a sweetener in it. Although we were allowed to use artificial sweeteners, and I didn't take out the gluten and I didn't take out the dairy. So specifically the sugars and flours.
Okay.
And but it was in week 3. The allergies immediately started letting up, and the bloating, a lifelong sinus infection cleared up. But it was in the 3rd week that I adopted this as a career, and that's when I realized I hadn't yelled at anybody in 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you exactly where I was standing in my kitchen, and like a ton of bricks, it hit me. Oh gosh, this has got something to do with the food. I had joined that support group, so I went there that weekend. No internet. I mean, this is 1996. And finally, I was able to ask my question, does this make people less irritable? Like 20 heads. Yeah.
So you went cold tofurkey because you just completely took it out, and so 3 weeks later.
No, I didn't quite believe it. So I was still drinking wine on the weekends. And then I had kind of just a really, really horrifying experience. And that's when I cut out the wine. So yeah, I mean, I was a cook. I knew how to cook. So I just started making the clean meals. But then February 19th, 1996, when I let go of the alcohol, then I started picking up, in how in 12-step groups you pick up a chip. So yeah.
Is food addiction something are we all susceptible to this sugar and flour? We just don't know it?
Yeah.
Or are some people more susceptible than others?
And more sensitive even?
Yes, I mean, there is a genetic, it's called a genetic anomaly. So there's a genetic component to it. However, when you see something like, so before tobacco comes into processed foods, already the obesity overweight rate in the United States is about 45%. In 1963, 20 years earlier, a tobacco company bought Hawaiian Punch, and they applied the tobacco addiction model to Hawaiian Punch. And this is a chilling document. It's an internal tobacco document. It's on file at the University of California, San Francisco. They have published on it. There's an explicit description of how they're going to transfer tobacco marketing to sugar for children. It's horrifying. But this is why, for example, juice boxes, which are sugar water, are the same shape and colors as packets of cigarettes.
Did they feel like that kids would feel more comfortable with cigarette packs when they got into their teens because of juice boxes and their enjoyment of them?
I think they just saw a market opportunity. Everybody knows that sugar is addictive. We already had the research on that in 1963. And so I think they were just developing a new market. And they really like that market because the younger you can addict an animal, any animal, including children, the harder it is to resolve, to put the addiction into remission. So here, they could ramp up the sugar content in baby formula, 52%.
What?
Oh,
and nobody was stopping them.
The baby formula?
It wasn't like the tobacco experience where they got, they got curtailed in advertising and everything else. Absolutely no restraint. So you see right after that, you see Kool-Aid being picked up by the tobacco companies, and then Capri Sun. And if it's a liquid, it gets into the system more quickly. It's just diabolical.
Mm-hmm.
They also started advertising like toys with cereals.
Yes.
Tell us about the actual types of advertising they used to lure us all to think that these foods were, they hit our bliss point, but they were fun, and what attracted that made us want them even more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when you addict children, and then what you do is you train them to nag their parents. I don't know if you've ever seen the Captain Crunch commercial where the babysitter has come and the children in the commercial, she's denying them Captain Crunch, and I don't remember exactly what they do to her, but she's the bad guy. She's made into the bad guy. So children, it's very hard to talk about. It's so awful. So use of idols, Spider-Man and McDonald's. There's a very diabolical thing going on now with Travis Scott. You want to eat like Travis Scott. Travis Scott is the right demographic. He's the right age, he's a rapper. And so they're using Travis Scott, and they have the Travis Scott meal. And you can go to McDonald's and you could order the Travis Scott meal. So in the commercial, Travis Scott is like, oh, you're like me, you're eating like me. We're eating together because we're friends. It's preying on lonely children. Because once you really get this addiction, you are lonely because you only have the addiction in your head. It's very hard to connect with other people. Plus, your body shape might be something that people are free to traumatize, stigmatize people about. It's a very, very, very sad life to be an addicted child. And anyway.
What is the definition of food addiction?
The American Psychiatric Association, over 50 years of research and discussion, have developed 11 criteria by which you can diagnose alcoholism. So for my doctoral dissertation, I validated those criteria for overeating. So the same behaviors manifest in overeating as in alcoholism, same behaviors. And then there's one chapter in the textbook on each of those behaviors because it answers the question, does this behavior also exist in overeating? So I went through the research and I said, yeah, look, here are 25 studies showing that this behavior exists in overeating. Here's 125 studies showing that that behavior exists in overeating. So I can go through the 11 behaviors if you would like.
I would love that.
Yeah.
Okay. So unintended use, Like you wake, I'm going to eat clean, and by 10 o'clock you're at the vending machine.
Let me ask a question before you start. If, as people are listening to this list, is there if you have 6 of these things, you may want to think about having a food addiction, or do you need all 11,
Listen.
or what would you
Y'all
suggest
listen.
people to listen out
Good
for as they're
question.
hearing this
So
list?
there are thresholds.
Okay.
2 or more is a mild addiction, 4 or 5 is a moderate addiction, and 6 and over is a severe addiction.
Okay, thank you.
So this was the big discovery out of the textbook. There were 2. 1, it's severe addiction, and 2, people are deeply traumatized. So unintended use,
Okay.
you know, you're going to eat 1 out of the package, and somehow the package is eaten. You're going to drive straight home, and your car turns itself into the fast food place. Unintended use.
Okay.
Number 2 is failure to cut back. And we see that over 70% of Americans are now overweight or obese. They don't want to be that way. They have tried. Michael Moss has got a statistic, 87% of Americans eat reduced calorie processed foods. So there are 87% of Americans want to cut back.
It don't work.
It's not working.
It don't work.
We see research that 100% of weight loss, well, 99.9% of weight loss is followed by weight regain. So most Americans are experiencing unintended use and failure to cut back. Number 3 is time spent. So gradually you're spending more time thinking about food, you're spending more time stopping, you are spending time planning to get it, and then recovering. So people literally, they will pass out. These are drugs. The brain is quite altered in the same way that addicted people brains are altered. Number 4 is cravings. Cravings are so prevalent that the food manufacturers use them. I saw a package in the store the other day that on the back of it said, highly addictive. Are you kidding?
They mocking
So you see
us.
these manufacturers trying to normalize addiction. So you get addiction, you're diagnosed with an addiction, but you think, oh, I don't have to do anything about it, it's normal.
It's not normal.
Yeah, so this is diabolical. And then number 4 is failure to fulfill roles. You can't get down on the floor with your kids, but you're still eating. You're too shamed to apply for that promotion, but you're still eating. Your joints are so destroyed that you can't work anymore, or you're so depressed that you can't work anymore. You're so obese that you can't work anymore and you're still eating. No, the next one is relationship problems. And if you are craving intensely and you're just like, you have a relationship, somebody you love in your household, you spend the whole evening waiting for them to go to bed so that you can go to the laundry room and get the whatever you hid there. It's very hard when you're craving to have a relationship with somebody, or somebody's complaining about the way you're eating and they're desperate for you to stop and you can't stop. Relationship problems. The next one is cutting back on activities. So you used to belong to the book club, but you don't go anymore because your body shape is not okay, or because you'd rather go home and eat, or because you're so depressed you're assuming that nobody wants to see you there. And then you get into hazardous use. I mean, this, you can see this is alcoholism, but it's people think of drinking and driving, hazardous use, or operating machinery. But you watch people coming out of a fast food place, you know, they're driving with their elbow because they're trying to get the French fries in fast enough.
Oh, no.
There is such a thing as blackout eating. It's not in the research, but it's in the 12-step manuals for food addiction. People get groggy, brain fog. It's dangerous. Then there's use in spite of knowledge of consequences. Everybody has that. Everybody's like, I shouldn't eat this, but I'm going to. My doctor said not to, but who cares? It's my birthday, you know. And then there's eating for the next one is tolerance. You're eating more than you used to. You used to stop for fast food once a week. Now you're stopping once a day. You used to only have that at night, and now you're having it at lunch. You used to just have that in the kitchen, but now it's also in the bedroom, in the den, in the laundry room. You used to buy this size container, and now you're buying 3 that size container, so that you can track tolerance. It's increased use. The addiction, it's the same for all addictions. And then the last one is using processed foods when you're not hungry. And what that is withdrawal avoidance. So when withdrawal starts, and we do have a proper withdrawal syndrome, and this is a hallmark of addictions, when it starts with a headache, or it starts with irritability, or it starts with depression, or it starts with stomach upset, it starts with fatigue. It's a very distinct syndrome, and people will use, they'll go get some caffeine, or they'll get something to eat to make themselves feel better. That's withdrawal avoidance. Yeah. So the most common ones, like I put out this quiz all the time. We have a big Facebook group, and what everybody seems to have: unintended use, failure to cut back, cravings, surprisingly time spent. People are just frustrated because it's in their head all the time. And then withdrawal avoidance, eating for reasons other than hunger, and the use in spite of knowledge of consequences. That, I mean, it was an epiphany, because I'm writing away on these chapters. Chapter 1, yeah, everybody's got that. Chapter 2, well, everybody's got that. Chapter 3, everybody's got that. Chapter 4, everybody's got that. Chapter 5, most people have that. Chapter 6, most people have that one. Wow. Okay. This is a severe addiction. And suddenly, it was just like a blinding light. You understand why nothing else is working. Because there are very specific things that you do for a severe addiction. And it's not weight loss.
Talk to us about those then, because
we may do some more clips later from that interview, because this is a very interesting video. I'm telling you, every part of that video is good, and those 2 ladies did very well letting her explain things. But I tell you, a lot of the stuff that she exposed on that, I was shocked. I mean, I had no idea that the tobacco companies bought Nabisco and Kraft and all of them. I had no idea, guys, but I tell you, when I did find out about that, I was really upset, because the lonely child that she's talking about, that would sit in front of the TV and watch all those commercials, that was me. So this stuff hit home for me. I mean, it make you almost want to cry, I'm telling you, because I remember being that lonely kid. I'm the youngest, and my sisters, they're all much older than me, so I was that kid. I was that addicted big kid that gained a lot of weight still in elementary school, and I held on that weight my whole life. So the prototype, or the architect, or the archetype that they targeted was me. And I know a lot of people who were around my age that can testify to this, that we were the kids, both our parents worked. A lot of us, we had a key around our neck and took ourselves home and watched TV and ate this crap food and junk food and potato chips and all this stuff. And this who they targeted. From cradle to grave, that's what they think of us. So that's why it's very important for people like you and me that wake up, that finally wake up and start getting healthy and and start getting off of this. We gotta spread the word, y'all. It can't be just me and this lady that's spreading this word, y'all. We have to share this information. Don't you love your family members? Share this information, y'all.